Next speaker is Asheen Phansey. And Asheen, if you'll excuse me for looking at my notes, oh, where are they at? They're right here. Is Product Manager of Sustainability for DaS Systems with SolidWorks. Asheen, thank you very, very much. You have the stage, but try to remember to stay, well, it doesn't matter in this case, because Asheen isn't presenting any graphics. So please help me welcome Asheen Phansey.
So I teach sustainable business courses to MBAs at Babson College, and one of the, actually, would you mind just starting the timer, because I know myself a little bit too well. So one of the things that I keep telling my students is stop putting so much effort into making your pretty PowerPoint slides and start focusing on the content of your talk. And thought maybe I should actually take my own advice. So no PowerPoint. Does anyone miss PowerPoint right now? Is anyone really jonesing for some slides? Excellent. Okay. And I wanted this to be more of a conversation, right? So I want to give you a little bit of a perspective of kind of my background and talk about what that means sort of for the future of sustainability in engineering software. I have an undergrad chemical engineering degree, and I spent most of my time in early career in sort of high-tech fields, biotech, aerospace. Like kind of resonant with the stories I've heard previously, I had sort of a epiphany that said, you know, I need to marry my values with my career. And so I've actually been in the sustainability space for the last 5 years or so. So relatively new to the CAD space. My background is more from consulting and from other work in corporate sustainability and sustainable design. So I wanted to kind of share my perspective a bit about how I've seen sort of the environmental movement evolve over the last, really started probably about 50 years ago. So how that evolves and then where engineering software fits into that. So there's three kind of major classes of that evolution. The first is what we might call end-of-tailpipe solutions. So the whole movement, I would argue, was launched in 1962 when Rachel Carson wrote Sound Spring. Anyone familiar with that book or read it? Great. So she basically said, hey, we're destroying aspects of our environment with the new chemicals that we're creating, and let's stop, you know, poisoning the earth. And so that led to EPA being founded in 1970, led to things like DDT being banned in 1972, which Environmental Defense was part of, you know, specific chemical bans like that. You had lead being removed from gasoline in the 80s. So you saw a lot of these, we're finishing the product development process and taking it to the end and realizing that that end is not ideal, and so let's ban that end, right? And you can clearly see the efficacy of these solutions where you say, well, let's stop releasing that chemical into the environment. You can also see the drawback of saying, well, we've got this entire process. We've got vendors chosen. We've got suppliers. We've got you know, chemical formulations built. And so how do we take that? Okay, well, now that's banned. How do we go back to the drawing board? There's a second somewhat parallel rise or shift in the sustainability movement or environmental movement writ large, and that was this whole sense of globalization. So you know, you had supply chains and value chains that were now spread out across the globe, and you had the information about the environmental impact starting to be realized from decisions made here, you know, being realized there, both in terms of seeing the effects and in terms of actually causing the effects. So, you know, oil shocks in the 70s, again in the 2000s, you know, the price of oil shooting up. You had Bhopal in 84, right? The Bhopal disaster, anyone familiar with that? Release of, I think it was methyl cyanide or methyl cyanate in India. Methyl isocyanate, thank you. Betraying the fact that I've abandoned my chemical engineering roots for some time. You had Exxon Valdez, 1989. Can you believe that was over 20 years ago? Exxon Valdez, it seems so clear, and it seemed like that brought environmental impact into our consciousness, the same as perhaps BP is bringing it into the consciousness of the current generation. Katrina in 2005, right? Of course, BP and Deepwater Horizon very recently. These led to this idea of what is sort of global sustainability? What does it mean, right? So the Brundtland Commission was this group that defined, came up with the first, I think, useful definition of sustainability, which is, living and working such that we don't rob future generations of their ability to live and work. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. We had the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992 that led to the formation of the Kyoto Protocol, and that was, and you have these conferences of the parties every year since then. So Copenhagen, COP15, Cancun, COP16. Really trying to realize that there are global effects of the environmental impacts that we create, and very simply, there's one atmosphere, right? A pound of carbon is a pound of carbon anywhere. So that's kind of the second shift that I've seen. And then the third shift is this idea of market solutions for sustainability and for sustainable design. So I mentioned EDF. We've often hear in the press that there's no successful example of a cap and trade mechanism out there. Well, that's not true. So EDF actually invented the idea of cap and trade for sulfur dioxide and used that to cut acid rain emissions. And the Kyoto Protocol looked at that and said that's a market solution that we could actually use and propose that for carbon. But you also see, more on the consumer side. So the Prius was released in 1997. And nobody, including myself, thought that we'd see so many Priuses on the road, 10 years later. You see things like Al Gore's movie, right, The Inconvenient Truth. You see, rise in sort of the consciousness of what is this climate question that we're all trying to think about. The House of Representatives passed the American Clean Energy and Security Act, also called the Waxman-Markey bill, cap and trade mechanism, right? Didn't get passed in the Senate. Maybe the House knew that it wouldn't get passed in the Senate, and so they did it anyway. But that was in, 2009, I think it was, or 2010. Unfortunately, that legislation hasn't gone very far. But you see a lot of these sort of pings in the market of saying, hey, there's some demand for this. Let's actually create these market-based solutions rather than legislating, right? In parallel with the market solutions on the regulatory side, you see these responses from a lot of corporations in saying, you know what, our customers are asking for this, and if they're not, they will soon be asking for this, and we want to lead because responding to legislation is not a way to create a competitive advantage because everyone has to do it, right? You see the WRI, the World Resources Institute, released this greenhouse gas inventory protocol, and a huge uptake, and it's become pretty much a worldwide standard for measuring company-level carbon footprint. You see a lot of scorecarding, right? So Walmart has released, a packaging scorecard, and will soon be releasing a product scorecard. You see McDonald's, P&G, IBM, these supplier scorecards that say, we're going to rate you on your environmental impact, and you're going to become a preferential supplier based on that impact being low. And when Walmart says statements like, based on your score, we're going to give you preferential shelf space in our stores, people start listening, right? I was moderating a panel with the heads of sustainability of Xerox, Sodexo, and Alcatel-Lucent in 2009. This was fall of 2009, deep recession, right? Heart of the recession. Sustainability is certainly not on, everyone's forefront of everyone's mind in the boardroom. And so I asked them the question, what would it take to get sustainability back into corporate consciousness? And I'm thinking they're going to say, carbon legislation finally being passed, price of oil going back to $200 a barrel, major disaster. This was pre-BP, so some major disaster, bringing it to the consciousness. And Patty Calkins from Xerox said, no, it's not any of those things. It's Walmart not letting up. And I stepped back and I said, well, Xerox isn't a major Walmart supplier, but Holly from Sodexo and Rich from Alcatel-Lucent both agreed. They said, yeah, it's Walmart not letting up. That's going to really drive sustainability to the forefront. Market solutions and not government regulations is sort of the future. So where does engineering software fit in? So there's a HBR paper that's really revelatory. That it's called "Why Sustainability is Now the Key Driver for Innovation." It was a September 2009 paper, and it lays out these 5 stages of maturity for a company in sustainability, and it kind of reflects what you've seen up here previously. So the first stage is sort of environmental compliance, right? And then the second stage is company-level sustainability initiatives. So things like infrastructure, LEED buildings, green buildings, paperless office initiatives, major energy efficiency projects for the company, carbon inventory for the company. And it's not until you get to that stage 3 of maturity where a company says, you know what, all of these things are incidental. Let's look at what actually our greatest impacts, which for most companies is the products and services, the value chain, right? the value chain in which they sit. So that's when you start seeing companies adopt these concepts like biomimicry, which you heard about earlier today, like the cradle-to-cradle or closed-loop production, like doing LCAs to drive green marketing campaigns, right? That's when you start seeing companies say, we need to figure out this innovation question. So the point of why I'm drawing out this evolution is to say that a life cycle assessment is a really sophisticated end of tailpipe solution, right? It's still end of tailpipe. To your question about is this done in the design phase or is it done after production, right? An LCA is basically saying, let's measure what we did and how we could have done it better, right? And so hearing a question about competition, right? So, are we at SolidWorks competing with PDC, competing with Sustainable Minds, competing with Eco Materials Advisor? I think no, in the sense that our competition is much more mindset and a locked mindset than it is necessarily each other's solutions. There was a brief time in which SolidWorks Sustainability was the only integrated sustainable design solution. That time is now over. There's some great other solutions out there, and I'm a little bit scared and a little bit excited at the same time by that. So we had a couple questions about, hey, we have this CAD package, but you guys have a sustainability solution. But that's not really that's a minority. The vast majority of our concern in terms of generating interest is, hey, you guys have this engineering department and design department, and you have this life cycle assessment work. Why aren't the two talking? I can't tell you how many customer visits I've gone to where I've walked in, and the engineering manager shook my hand and introduced himself to me, and the sustainability person shook my hand and introduced themselves to me, and then the two of them turned and shook each other's hand and introduced themselves to each other. Same company, or one of them was late because they said, gosh, I'm sorry, I'd never been to this conference room before. I've never been to this side of the building before. That's our competition. How does engineering software and the solutions that we can create within engineering software drive sustainability, not the other way around, right? So I think part of that future will be from creating intelligence for the models that we build. And that's slightly different from saying, hey, engineer, you should pull up this dashboard and start looking at the impact, or you should click this button and go to this other interface and start looking at the life cycle or the impact of what you're doing. Rather, it's, by the way, when you need it, this intelligence is already built into the models, right? That, I think, is where the future of what engineering software can do to drive sustainability. Now, part of that intelligence is in materials, absolutely, right? So it's saying, by the way, do you know that this material is really impactful in the manufacture or the extraction, or that other material can be used in some different ways? But that's not the only solution, right? Or that's not the only criterion. So, when I was a consultant doing some sustainability work, one of the customers that I worked with was Avery Dennison. They make office products, and we were working on their just simple 3-ring binders, and they asked a simple question of, these binders are made from PVC. Is it better for the environment to switch to polypropylene? And when you think about PVC, it's really impactful in the actual manufacture of it. It's really impactful in the destruction of it. I mean, when you burn it, you get, you know, this dioxin gas and Agent Orange, and it's really bad stuff. And it's often done in developing countries, and there's all sorts of issues on sort of both ends of the PVC life cycle. But in between, it's a really inert material, right? So if you have something that's going to last for a really long time, you can kind of, here's where I wave my hands, and here's where you find out I'm really an MBA. You can sort of amortize the badness of the PVC production across the life cycle, and so per year or per time unit, it actually looks better than, or is better than, say, a polypropylene solution, which might be less impact, but you may, you know, it may depolymerize, it may break down, you know, you have to replace it, et cetera. Your iPad is getting angry at me. And so, you know, that's one of those cases where you really have the question of how is this used? And that's what I'm going to finally conclude is sort of a warning and a challenge to us, which is CAD software is really good at sort of the first couple levels of design, which are you know, parametric optimization, you know, questioning the thing, or questioning the parameters of the thing, and questioning the way the thing is made. You know, an example of that would be, you know, taking, say, a Civic, right, and making it really aerodynamic and reducing its drag, and so increasing its miles per gallon, right? That's making the thing better. The next level that I think we're maybe not so good at, but still capable of doing, is questioning the product. So that's, you know, making a Prius, let's say, in our analogy here, which is, you know, gas, electric, hybrid. It's a different product. It's a fundamentally different solution, but it still exists within the existing infrastructure. It still drives on roads. It still fuels up at gas stations. It still sits in your garage. How do we get to the Leaf, right, as an example, which is fundamentally different product system, right? This is, you know, the infrastructure is different. The way that you interact with the product is different. The requirements of, you know, the economy are different in this case. You know, the sustainability of it improves with the grid improving. I mean, it's a very fundamentally different solution. Is that something that we can really do? Can we go to someone and say, I know you're modeling this in CAD, but do you really need this product? Because the greenest way to produce this is not to produce it. That's the question that I want to challenge us with. If engineering software can support those kinds of fundamental redesign solutions, that's when I think we know we'll have won this battle of mind share. So, thanks.
Thank you, Phansey. No, we have time for questions. Okay. Yeah. So do we have any questions out there? I'm sure we do. That's very stimulating conversation. Yep. Do we have a question in the back from Brad?
So, Asheen, thank you. I really enjoyed that. I want to point out that Asheen is not PTC. That we've had the wrong slide up there the entire time. But I want to reinforce the call that you've just made about rethinking and moving forward to getting a larger and larger and larger picture, particularly the PVC example that you mentioned. I want to raise this point now because I'm going to bring it up again when I introduce our keynote speaker, and I'm going to refer back to it because it's not what we do for ourselves isn't as important as what we do for others.
We'll take this gentleman here on the right, and then you, Martin.
Hi, Brian Kolker from the National Institute of Building Sciences. Naturally, we work in the building space, but one of the things, to your last point as well, is at what point do we get to selling services rather than selling actual pieces of equipment? Does a building owner really care if they have the newest chiller, or do they care if the environment in the building is cool or warm or whatever the people need in that building?
Right. Yeah, I mean, fundamentally, we can go all the way back to tracing, measuring the economy by GDP, right? It's really a measure of material conversion. and not a measure of value creation, right? And so there's a great example that one of our designers did in SolidWorks sustainability of a bucket, right? He took just a plain 5-gallon bucket, and he said, not how can I design a better bucket, but how can I better hold 5 gallons of water? And so he led him to one of those bag-in-a-box designs where he had a corrugated paper with a plastic liner and a little plastic spout where you pour out your your liquid. And led him to, and this was, 2 kilograms of carbon versus 8 kilograms of carbon. And really, 4 or 5-fold reduction in impact. And that led him to say, can we rethink what we're trying to do? And, to your point, it's how do we desegregate material conversion from value creation, right? I think it's going to take fundamentally a drive from the business side of measuring things differently. Measuring, dollars of revenue versus carbon, or just impact created as separate from value created. But I think there's space for engineering software there, absolutely.
Excellent, thank you. Martin, you got a question?
Martin Fisher from Integrated Facility Engineering Stanford. Essentially similar question. Why limit sustainability to environmental sustainability on the cost side? And you started to answer the question. That's what I find a bit bizarre. What are we really sustaining? In the US, it seems to be cast in just a very narrow perspective most of the time, only giving us levers on the cost side of things, like, not have that pulp, and not having specific or very good metrics on the value side. So and maybe it's coming from the accounting system. If you own some forest, the only way to get value from the forest, for this forest to show up on your balance sheet, is to cut it down and sell the wood. And so there's something fundamentally wrong with just how we look at things. But I think engineering software has a role to play there by pointing out the opportunities. And I think that's where you were going in your answer.
Yeah, there's 2 really key things that you raised there. One is the idea that hitherto sustainability has been cast in the same shadow as cost reduction, and simply affecting the bottom line by reducing costs, with ignoring the innovation issue, that growing the top line, as opposed to simply shrinking the cost out of the bottom line. And that's new product generation, new ideas. It's everything that we've talked about. And the second thing that you raise, I think, is a critical point, is the idea of valuing natural capital and natural capital services. It's sort of ludicrous that you cut down this tree and use it to as toilet paper. It's a little silly, right? If you consider everything that the tree can do and all of the services that you can provide, it's missing an opportunity to really leverage a lot of that natural capital to create more value. So it's something we absolutely have to figure out.
Any other questions, thoughts? Okay, let's thank our first group of speakers and then take a 10-minute biological break. All right.